How does a cab driver and washerman become king and queen of Narnia? How do fishermen start a revival? They follow the lion's call. Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Lion's Gospel, the Lion's Call. In this video we will be looking at episodes from C.S. Lewis's Narnia book, The Magician's Nephew, my personal favourite, and some of the stories involving Jesus' disciples in the Gospel of Mark. We're actually still going to be in the first chapter of Mark, which is cool. So, The Magician's Nephew. Now, this is not one of the most well-known of the Narnia stories, probably because it wasn't adapted for cinema, like The Lion, Witch and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But for me, like I said, it's probably my favourite Narnia book because it tells the origins of Narnia, and I love a good origin story. It explains important details and fills in the gaps from Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, like who is the White Witch? How was Narnia created? Who is the Professor? And why was the wardrobe a portal to another world? I will quickly summarise the plot for those who are unfamiliar with the book. So, it begins in London, where a young girl called Polly meets a boy called Diggory, who has just moved in with his terminally ill mum with his uncle and aunt next door. Polly and Diggory become friends and discover that his uncle is an evil magician who tricks them to entering a world of portals. They go to an ancient world where Diggory foolishly releases an evil queen who later becomes the White Witch. This queen follows them back to Earth and wants to destroy and subjugate it. Diggory and Polly manage to transport the queen and their uncle Andrew and accidentally a kind cab driver and his horse into the portal. This leads them to a dark, formless world which is then given life by Aslan. They witness this lion create Narnia, and then they see Aslan drive off the evil queen and rebuke Andrew. Now Diggory has done evil by awakening the evil queen, and he has to undergo a quest to undo the evil that was done. His quest is to retrieve a silver apple from an enchanted garden. The children complete the quest, and the silver apple becomes a magical tree to ward off the evil queen for hundreds of years. The cab driver and his wife Helen become the first rulers of Narnia, and the children return home. Aslan then gives Diggory a silver apple, which cures his mother from her illness. So there's quite a lot of detail, but I'll give you a bit of a key summary. Basically, Diggory's messed up. He's brought the evil queen back to life and took her to Narnia with a cab driver, which is important, and the uncle. Now Diggory has to undo his evil by going on a quest to get a silver apple, which he does. So the key parts of the story that I really want to hone in on today are the calling of the cabbie and his wife Helen by Aslan, and an important choice that Diggory has to make on his quest with Polly. Let me read the moment where this cab driver named Frank, his wife, is called from our world into Narnia. Aslan threw up his shaggy head, opened his mouth, and uttered a long, single note, not very loud, but full of power. Polly's heart jumped in her body when she heard it. She felt sure that it was a call, and that anyone who heard that call would want to obey it, and, what's more, would be able to obey it, however many worlds and ages lay between. And so, though she was filled with wonder, she was really not astonished or shocked when all of a sudden a young woman with a kind, honest face stepped out of nowhere and stood beside her. Polly knew at once that it was the cabbie's wife, fetched out of our world, not by any tiresome magic rings, but quickly, simply, and sweetly as a bird flies to its nest. I love the richness of this call. And I believe it imitates the call that Jesus makes to his first followers in the Gospel of Mark. So I'm going to read from Mark 1:16-20. This is when Jesus calls his first disciples. As Jesus passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and followed him. And then he went a little further. He saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, who were in their boat, mending the nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. This is such an interesting passage. First, note that Jesus makes the first move, which is highly unorthodox. In the Jewish world at the time, it was up to prospective disciples to approach a rabbi and to request to follow them. Jesus, as usual, flips convention on his head and commands the men to follow him. Note the language used. It is not a request nor an invitation. It's an imperative command. The words of Jesus command us to follow. Let's look at this call in more detail. It is an immediate and urgent call. The immediate, urgent call. The reaction of both sets of men is the same. The command to follow is met with an immediate response. Now, the word used here by Mark can mean either immediately or urgently, and it is used over 40 times in his gospel. The other portraits of Jesus, although marvelous in their own way, do not convey the same sort of urgency that Mark does. Often, when reading it, you feel like you're racing through the narrative. Fast-paced, invigorating, exciting. Next time you read it, take note of the rapid-fire individual stories, also called pericopes. They're like machine gun stories, just firing rapidly. I argue that Mark is the original machine gun preacher. And an important way that Mark demonstrates this is through this word immediately. Immediately the heavens opened. Immediately the disciples left their nets and followed him. Immediately a leper is healed. Immediately the Pharisees went out of the Herodians to conspire against him. Immediately the woman who touched Jesus' garment was healed. Immediately the disciples went out on the boat to Bethsaida. And then immediately Jesus walks out to meet them. Imagine this story as a theatre production. Imagine watching a play and seeing the rapid set redesign and costume changes that would be needed for this story. Mark is a master storyteller, and this immediacy or urgency is a key part of his literary technique. Mark has a story to tell, and it is an immediate and urgent story. It is the most important and urgent story that has ever been told. It is the story of Jesus redeeming mankind through his life, death, and resurrection. It is the story of the reign of God being established. Therefore, the disciples' reaction, the urgency of the disciples takes on greater meaning. We can imagine Simon Peter and Andrew up to their waists in water, perspiration dripping off their face as they get ready to cast their nets again. This net would be 15 to 20 feet across, weighed down by stones to sink to the bottom, where the fish would then congregate, and then there would be an attached rope which pulled the net together once there were enough fish for the catch. Then suddenly they hear this voice call from the shore, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And remarkably, they go. No hesitation, no turning back. I wonder this sometimes. Was the net left lying on the lake bed? I imagine a person arriving by the lake shortly after, seeing the trailing rope, grabbing hold of it, and seeing the net left mid-catch, wondering, marveling, what could have happened for someone to have left their net like this, to have left their tools of their trade, their source of income and security? Surely it must have been something dramatic. Again, Jesus sees two other fishermen, James and John, with their father Zebedee. These fishermen are better off as Zebedee can afford to hire servants and has a boat. It's mentioned that James and John are together mending nets. But as soon as Jesus says, "Follow me," they leave the boat, leaving their father and the hired servants behind them. Again, I imagine this scene afterwards. The call to follow. James and John placing down the broken nets and disembarking their boat, leaving a confused and most probably irate father. He has lost the successors to his business. This trade is probably what his father taught him, and his father before him, and his father before him, spanning generations. But now all loyalty to the family trade has been discarded. The family ties have been snapped like the broken netting in their boats. And he looks on as his sons move out of his vision. The ones that he taught the secrets of his trade. The ones who were there on the day of their first catch. And he watches his heirs and successors fade into the horizon in the footsteps of the one called Jesus, because they left immediately. Just like Helen, the call is given and the response is instantaneous. Helen comes into the story with soap suds still clinging to her forearms. The laundry is left sodden wet back in her world, never to be worn again. The disciples also walk sodden wet, having left tools, trade, and ties back on the lake. Their master has called. They must follow, and follow immediately. It is an immediate and urgent call. Secondly, this is a costly call. Let's return to the magician's nephew. As I said earlier, the boy Diggory has awakened the evil queen. She was driven off initially by the presence of Aslan, but Aslan gives Diggory a mission to repair the wrong that he has caused. He is charged to travel to a distant garden, find a certain tree, pick the silver apple which grows on it, and return it to Aslan. So after a long journey, Diggory and Polly do locate the tree and pick the silver apple. But at this point, the evil queen arrives onto the scene again. She has picked one of the apples, and it has given her immortality. She speaks and tempts Diggory, arguing that if he returned to his own world with that apple, he would be able to heal his mum from that terminal illness, the thing he most desires in his heart, to heal his mum from that terminal illness, rather than returning it to Aslan as he promised and fulfilling his duty. Diggory is torn. He loves his mum so deeply. He believes that he has the choice of saving his mum or fulfilling his duty to Aslan. On the way back, he is tossing and turning, and it is tormenting him. But despite the temptations, Diggory proves himself a faithful follower. He is faithful to the call. He rejects the witch's offer and returns the apple to Aslan. Aslan then instructs him to throw the apple, where it blooms into a tree full of silver apples as it falls. Aslan then, in his grace and mercy, instructs Diggory to pick another apple for his mother to heal her. This is such a fantastic illustration of the cost of discipleship. Diggory is torn between what he loves most and his duty to Aslan. On the journey home, he is heartbroken. He knows deeply and intimately the cost of the lion's call. Yet what keeps him going is the face of Aslan, because when Diggory initially described his mother's illness, his noble face shined with tears, and deep down, Diggory knows that it is worth the cost. The call is worth the cost. We have already seen a slight demonstration of this cost of discipleship in Mark 16-20. Peter, Andrew, James, and John have already left their occupation and their family behind to follow Jesus. For James and John, particularly, leaving a successful business is surely quite the sacrifice already. Surely that is enough. But no, let's skip forward a few chapters to Mark chapter 8. So we have reached a crucial point in Mark's story. This is the tipping point. This is the turning point. Jesus in the preceding chapters has been preaching the good news that the reign of God has arrived. The kingdom of God has come near. He has healed, performed miracles, and taught his disciples. But now we reach the point where the narrative focus shifts towards Jesus' death. Jesus begins by teaching the disciples that he must endure suffering, rejection, and death. Then he addresses the crowds and the disciples and states this: "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." Let's just take the first part of this statement, this denial of self. Now, this denial of self is not just abstaining from a sweet treat. It's not saying I won't indulge myself in the next Mars bar. It's not about ascetic practices. It's not about a moderation of our natural desires. No. This is a far, far more radical command by Jesus. To be a disciple, to follow the call, Jesus demands nothing less than a renunciation of the self. The denial of our dreams, our goals and desires. To renunciate all of that. It is the death of me and the oblivion of I. My detailed life plan, my desire to be significant, all of it is cast into the void to perish. This is perhaps the more pertinent challenge to us in the hyper-individualistic West, where the self is given supreme importance. I have been told since preschool, secondary school, college, university, that the I matters. that I need to do well in school, that I should get a degree, that I should get a good job, that I should get a house, I should get a wife, that I should take this holiday, I should do this, I should do that I should be happy. My dreams, my desires, my wants, they matter. Now, I'm not advocating a totally joyless life in which we all become hyper-religious and stand around and don't have any sort of fun and have no sort of pleasure and success. But the call stands. The call lingers in the air. The call to death. The call to self-renunciation. Deny the self by united with Jesus' desires, by united with Christ. To really twist the knife into this statement, Jesus mentions that we must take this denial to the point of the cross. Now let's just think for a moment how incredibly challenging and offensive this statement is. Unbelievably offensive, almost incredibly rude. I guess many of us don't think that Jesus as being rude, but this is incredibly offensive, really offensive. Unlike us today, crucifixion for these people was a very present reality. Most of us are thankfully removed from the horror of crucifixion, torture, and death. But many scholars believe that Mark was writing to Christians in Rome who were being persecuted or had been persecuted by Nero Caesar. For the disciples themselves, it's an ever-present reality. The rows of crosses on the wayside, the twisted limbs splayed out on the crossbeam, the ultimate expression of Roman power, to strip away all dignity of man made in the image of God, to strip away humanity and to make a person a symbol of folly, made to be a gross spectacle, a shame that cannot be hidden, for their nails hold them fast. This is the horror of the cross. This is the offensiveness of the cross. It is a living death. You are still respiring, but the self has already been ripped away and given in shame to the community. This is the offense of Christ's words, that you might give yourself up, even to the point of ultimate shame and death, that it might cost you everything, that like Diggory, you might give up which is most precious to you. Like most of the disciples who lost their lives for their faith, would you be willing to lay it all on the line for Jesus? That is the incredible, heartbreaking cost of the call. Okay, so you're making this become a disciple business seem a little bit difficult and quite hard, and you're not making it sound very good. This is sort of a hard sell. I'm not going to lie and say it is easy. I'm not going to lie and say that I have it all worked out and that I truly understand the immediacy, urgency of the gospel, or that I have denied all of me, or that sometimes I feel like giving up. That happens. However, what I have come to realize is this urgent call, this immediate call, this costly call, it is the only call which truly, truly transforms you. Let's return to the cabbie. His name is Frank, and his wife Helen. This cabbie is just a normal Londoner, quite rough and ready, rough around the edges, with a tough menial job. But there is an element of kindness to him as he loves his wife, and he also cared well for his horse, who's called Strawberry, by the way, which is pretty cool. And if we return to Lewis's description, let me just find the right page. It says this. Lewis describes how the cabbie, the longer he spends with Aslan, the longer he spends in Narnia, the longer he spends in proximity to Aslan, how he starts to change. His voice, usually rough, becomes slower and richer, more kingly. The cabbie and his wife become more regal in appearance and bearing. And this is what Lewis says. But it was night. This is just as they're about to be coronated and become king and queen of Narnia. He says this, but it was neither hair nor clothes that made them look so different from their own selves. Their face had a new expression, especially the king's. All the sharpness and cunning and quarrelsomeness which he had picked up as a London cabbie seemed to have been washed away, and the courage and kindness which he had always had were easier to see. You see this? No longer was he just a cab driver and a washer, and no longer was Helen just a washerwoman, but they were now a king and queen of Narnia. The revelation of the qualities and characteristics that were there all along, being revealed all along. But they can only truly flourish when they follow Aslan and spend time with him. That's when our true being comes to the forefront. You see, this urgent and costly call is a transformation to our true selves. As we follow the example of Jesus, as we imitate him, we become truly what I should be. Let's return to the fishermen that Jesus calls in Mark 1:16-20. Simon Peter, Andrew, James, and John. I looked up the qualities of a professional fisherman in that time, and it's probably quite similar to this time as well. It's a difficult job. But this is what the commentary said to me. The qualities of a professional fisherman at that time were steadfastness, stamina, tenacity, courage, teamwork, and faith, because it's a tough job and you have to keep the faith. Now, many of the disciples don't always exhibit the traits perfectly in the story of Jesus. I'm thinking of Peter especially. However, it's clear that Jesus sees something in them at the time. He sees the reason for asking fishermen to be his disciples. And by the time that Jesus has ascended to heaven, they have truly been transformed. They are no longer just fishers of fish, but they have become fishers of men. We see them exhibit the patience in the upper room, waiting for the Holy Spirit to fall. The faith that Jesus' words would come true. The teamwork of being united in one mind and one purpose. The tenacity to keep going despite persecution, despite being beaten and stoned and hated. The stamina to persevere to the end, despite torture and death. And finally, the courage to address and speak the good news of Jesus. We see in Acts 2, Peter addresses a huge crowd. This fisherman. And he says this, the good news of Jesus. He says the good news of Jesus to them. He preaches the gospel to them. And then 3,000 men and women believe in the good news of Jesus. The fishers of fish have become fishers of men at last. They have been transformed. Join me in prayer. God, let us believe in the urgency of your gospel again. May our obedience be immediate. Let us remember that we are disciples and you are our master. We will follow you in our community. We will follow you as we reach out into Europe. Let us stop putting things off for tomorrow, after we have caught the fish, after we have mended the nets, after the washing is done, after the Netflix series is watched. No, let us embrace the cost of following you. Let us lay down the I and follow after you with our cross on our shoulders. And let us remember how losing everything, paradoxically, is how we gain our true selves. Paradoxically, is how we gain our true selves. But because we become more like you, Jesus. Because our true self lies beyond the cross. Our true self lies beyond the cross. How does a cab driver and washerman become king and queen of Narnia? How do fishermen start a revival? They follow the lion's call. They follow the lion's call. It is too urgent to hesitate. The gospel is too urgent to hesitate. The call is too costly not to pay the price. And far, far too wonderful and transformational to ignore. Let the nations of Europe respond to this call again. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.